Hey everybody, Marcus here. In the feminist book entitled A Woman's Way of Knowing, originally published in 1986, the authors develop an epistemological thesis meant to challenge the supposed phallocentric concept of how people think. In this book, a distinction is made between separate knowers and connected knowers. Now, separate knowing is described in this book as the game of impersonal reason that has belonged traditionally to men. The quote continues, "Separate knowers are tough-minded. They are like doormen at exclusive clubs. They do not let anything in unless they are pretty sure it is good. Presented with a proposition, separate knowers immediately look for something wrong, a loophole, a factual error, a logical contradiction, or the omission of contrary evidence. Separate knowers play the doubting game." Peggy McIntosh developed her own variant of this separate knower, connected knower breakdown. Why, she asks, should there be such a focus on the people at the top, on the mountain stronghold of white men, when we need to study the values of women and minorities? McIntosh continues on with her mountain value metaphor in distinguishing her two ways of knowing, a narrow, patriarchal, male, vertical way, and a richer, female, lateral way. The male-dominated elite, the vertical thinkers, aim at exact thinking, or decisiveness, or mastery of something, or being able to make an argument and take on all corners, or turning in a perfect paper. Vertical thinking is triggered by words like excellence, accomplishment, success, and achievement. Lateral thinking, on the other hand, is more spiritual, relational, inclusive. McIntosh thinks that women and minorities tend to be lateral thinkers. For laterals, the aim is not to win, but to be in a decent relationship with the invisible elements of the universe. McIntosh continues on to say that the quest for knowledge as a universal human understanding is vertical thinking that has a hidden ethos of using logic in its either or, right or wrong, kill or be killed style of thinking. From this, McIntosh concludes that young white males are dangerous to themselves and the rest of us, especially in the nuclear age. Their orientation towards logic and achievement is what makes them so threatening. Peggy McIntosh's project is to slowly shift the curriculum in schools to move away from vertical thinking and towards lateral thinking, towards a listen and believe disposition. Now, let us think a little bit about what has just been said. To do this, however, I will need to put on my vertical thinking hat. And it must be that white maleness in me acting out again. But am I a vertical thinker because I am white or because I am male? Now, McIntosh does not say, but from what she argues, if minorities tend to be lateral thinkers and a black man can be a minority, then it follows that it must be my whiteness that is causing this thinking. But then white women would be vertical thinkers too. However, women are argued by McIntosh to mostly be lateral thinkers. From this must follow that vertical thinking is mostly an interplay of whiteness and maleness. Another interesting consequence of this argument is the claim about minorities as lateral thinkers. Now, surely a black man is a minority in the United States, but he could hardly be considered a minority in, say, Nigeria. Does the black man in Nigeria still think laterally when he is neither a woman, a minority, or white? Well, again, McIntosh does not say. But perhaps this is not a problem in her argument, but just my vertical thinking acting up again. But let us look at the broader consequences of what has been presented in Women's Way of Knowing. Now, feminism has the concept of the patriarchy. This concept has been described in such nebulous terms that it is difficult to conceive intelligibly what feminists mean. I want to use the concepts found in Women's Way of Knowing in an attempt to make patriarchy intelligible for us vertical thinkers. First, let us make a single distinction between feminists. To do this, I will use, well, religious symbolism. You have the feminist laity. These are the mindless protesters converted to the message, but who have little in-depth insight into the origins of their convictions. They're the useful and public, visibly idiots of feminism. Big Red would be, one of the laity. Now, you have feminists like Anita Sarkeesian. Now, Anita is, as I see her, the equivalent of a televangelist. She aims at generating money by preaching the feminist message. Whether or not she believes in the feminist message is not important. The message itself is merely a vehicle for profit. Next, you have a contingent of gender studies academics. These are the clergy. They have some core books of worship, what they preach from, and their mission is conversion of the laity and ordination of more clergy. Finally, you have a contingent of academic philosophers, which I would consider the true believers. These are the women who write the feminist holy books. They write these books because they truly believe in the message. These books are, not necessarily bestsellers, but these books are usually consumed by the clergy and some of the laity. Let us call these true believers the feminist prophets. These prophets, would be women such as Andrea Dworkin, Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, and so forth. There's one final group I would like to call out. Those are the fanatics. These are the radical lesbian activist types, such as Valerie Solanas. They're mostly of the laity, but much more radicalized. These fanatics are also true believers, but they're not quite up to snuff in producing influential material. Now, the prophets are by far the most interesting group because their ideas are feminism as pure as the driven snow. It is feminism in its most philosophically attuned form, as far as one can even call these women philosophers. These prophets create the seeds from which grow all further feminist thoughts. The feminist clergy, have a large hand in growing these seeds. The clergy does this by, interpreting the holy scriptures produced by the prophets, scrutinizing it, refining it, publishing books and articles about the ideas, and so forth. The sophistry of the prophets is complex, nuanced, and sometimes surprisingly full of vertical thinking. These works are dispassionate and cold misandry, but here, too, we cannot come to see their words as being intentionally misandrous. No, misandry is not the source of these words. It is merely a necessary corollary to the truth the prophets see. Let me clarify. For Nietzsche, atheism was not a goal, not a position he fought for. No, atheism was what necessarily followed from what he perceived as true of a reality. In Nietzsche's reality, God could not exist only on logical grounds because reality did not allow for such a being. So in this way too, these feminist prophets have misandry as merely the logical consequence that comes out of how they perceive reality. Whether these prophets represent real feminism or not, it really is not of interest to me. What is of interest to me is that these prophets are the foundation for a feminism that indeed exists, a feminism that is massively influential, a feminism that is changing the world. These prophets offer the purest distinction of that feminism. Now, the products of these prophets are ideas like the patriarchy. Once we come to understand how the patriarchy is constructed in thought, so too will it start to make sense why certain changes are pushed by feminists. I posit that the changes that are taking place due to feminism are legitimate changes in combating the patriarchy. But what is the patriarchy? Well, it could not be any simpler of a concept. I posit that, according to these prophets, the patriarchy is the entirety of that which has been created through vertical thinking. As feminists assert that all things are socially constructed, so too all of creation becomes a construct of the mind, more specifically, a construct of the white male mind. Now, let us give some exposition to this, as, it might be hard to understand. Let us imagine something as simple as a cup meant to hold water. The construction of a cup is patriarchal in that it adheres to logic. A cup is not a horse after all. Therefore, it is an exclusive and not inclusive concept. A cup is also bound to the logical function of holding water. Through vertical thinking, a cup is only a good cup if it can hold water, and it is a bad cup if it cannot hold water. In fact, the latter of the two would hardly be considered a cup at all. This entails that a thing is either a cup or is not a cup. This again is vertical thinking. So too in this way can we look at more complex objects. Let us look at something in nature this time around. Let us look at a tree. Now, let us distinguish between two things here. First, we have the sensory experience that develops while we gaze upon a tree. The second thing is the concept of the tree itself. The concept of a tree is not the sensory experience itself. When we think of trees in the second way, we will think in terms of patterns, in universals. We will think that there are types of trees, each type distinguished from another based on some attribute we deem worthy of distinction. But how very patriarchal of us. We have chosen to distinguish based on differences and not on commonalities. This classification system is itself patriarchal. Why do we distinguish on differences instead of commonalities? Why do we distinguish at all? To distinguish is to be exclusionary. To distinguish is to say a thing is or is not that from which it is to be distinguished, and as such, patriarchal. But if we continue this process and look at every concept ever conceived, what we find is that all concepts are littered with vertical white male thinking. If this is true, then patriarchy truly is everywhere and within everything. How could it be not? But if it is the case that patriarchy is everywhere and in everything, and it is also true that minorities and women think laterally and not vertically, then it indeed would be the case that the intelligible world discriminates against women and minorities. I've tried to think of an analogy to try and relate this idea existentially, to our poor vertical male minds. And the best I could come up with is the following. Imagine yourself arguing with a hysterical feminist. Now, imagine the anger bubbling up in you. You start to feel your blood boiling as you hear nonsense spewing from her mouth. You cannot make any sense of what is going on. Your mind cannot wrap itself around the combination of words she is using. She is telling you that the smell of red is happier than the taste of the C major scale. Your vertical mind cannot resolve the words in their concepts and still yield intelligible meanings in what has been said. Your vertical mind is not set up to think this way. It is not lateral. Now, imagine that is how women and minorities experience everything in reality. To women and minorities, white men sound like feminists sound like to white men. Imagine what it would be like if cars were engineered like the speech of feminists. Would you not feel discriminated against as a white male vertical thinker if you could not figure out how to drive it by using logic? Though a little dramatic and hyperbolic, I imagine that existentially, this is what the feminist prophets mean when they describe their existential experience of the patriarchy. From this account, then, male privilege makes sense. Male privilege, then, is simply having the world immediately intelligible. Male privilege is cars constructed using a logical system. Male privilege is road laws that have exclusionary practices like the right of way or driving only on one side of the road. These things are patriarchal male privilege. These things have been designed with logic and fit the male vertical way of thinking. But what would lateral thinking look like? Well, this too is nicely explained by feminism. White men do not have epistemic access to this mode of thinking. White men cannot conceive of it because they are behind the veil of privilege. As everything is organized, including language, to the male mode of vertical thinking, it is impossible for a man to think otherwise. This is where men need to listen and believe women's lived experiences. Now, to us vertical thinkers, this can be analogized to something having, like a religious experience. If I have a religious experience, and it is the case that you do not have the epistemic access to my experiences, then you can either believe what I describe or dismiss it. No amount of words will be able to convey the experience itself. Now, if this is the case, then we can look upon vertical thinking and lateral thinking as two systems that cannot be explained in terms of the other. This is similar to the conflict between emotion and logic. And more specifically, emotion cannot be reduced to logic, because if it could, then emotion would be a derivative of logic. In the same way, logic is itself not reducible to emotion, as then logic would be a derivative of emotion. Now, if lateral thinking could be reduced to logic, then this makes the patriarchy impossible, as lateral thinking would merely be a version of vertical thinking. If vertical thinking could be reduced to lateral thinking, then it would follow that ultimately the patriarchy would be a product of lateral thinking. As feminists claim that the patriarchy exists and that white men are vertical thinkers, and a shift to lateral thinking will dismantle the patriarchy, then it follows that lateral thinking and vertical thinking cannot be reduced to each other. So what this means is that any attempt to use vertical thinking concepts, such as logic, to argue against lateral thinking is not valid. It would be like me trying to logically disprove that you feel angry. Such a proof is not possible. So, if we take it all together, it would appear that not only do white men have no access to this lateral thinking, but we also do not have a valid tool to speak about it outside of faith. If this is true, then any attempt to argue against lateral thinking is simply oppression. Now, what also becomes immediately intelligible as a consequence of this is the feminist notion that all white men are oppressors. This one is easy to demonstrate. If indeed white men are only capable of vertical thinking, and the product of vertical thinking is the patriarchy, and the patriarchy is oppressive, then white men are only capable of creating oppression, as every thought will be a vertical thought that just adds to the patriarchy. Therefore, all white men are oppressors. Our only salvation is to listen and believe. But even then, we should only ever repeat pre-digested lateral thoughts, because any independent thought will necessarily be an oppressive vertical thought. Is this not what feminists have been trying to tell us all along? Well, surely it is. But perhaps to view white male thought as oppressive, to view vertical thought as oppressive is not nuanced enough. What sort of oppression do they refer to? Well, surely they mean racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and so on. But how can these things be linked back to vertical thought? Well, this too is easy to explain. If everything that exists is patriarchal, and racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on exist, then it necessarily follows that racism, sexism, and homophobia are patriarchal. The corollary to this is that racism, sexism, and homophobia are products of vertical thinking. However, I do not believe that the feminist prophets hold men responsible for these forms of oppression, at least not in a coarse way. I think they see racism and sexism in the way that Nietzsche saw atheism. Racism and sexism necessarily follow from white male vertical thinking. The analogy I would like to use is that racism and sexism are like a side effect of a drug that also does something good. Sort of like heart medicine that also causes nightmares. The white male has good intentions by making the heart medicine available, but inevitably he brings nightmares with it. As vertical thinking was a medicine applied to the masses in order to produce civilization, it produced the side effects of racism, sexism, and overall oppression of all those lateral thinkers. I believe that the feminist prophets see lateral thinking as a medicine of society that in turn does not have these side effects. Why do they believe this? Well, I will cover that later in the next video in this series. So what does a feminist mean when she says she wants to smash the patriarchy? Well, this is a threefold project. In the first place, she needs to stop the bleeding, meaning she needs to plug as many sources of vertical thought as she can. She needs to shut down as many white male speakers as possible so no more poison seeps into the world, After all, we had previously shown that all white male thought is vertical, therefore oppressive. Policing of all male spaces is also necessary. Policing male-only spaces stops any vertical thought from brewing. From where men gather without the supervision of women, so too vertical thought follows. So in this way, the workplace needs to be policed. Draconian quotas need to be put into place, not so that women reach parity with men in representation, but so there is no place where men are free to think vertically. This holds true, at least, for all knowledge worker occupations. Occupations where thinking forms the core of productive activities. The second thing our feminist liberators will need to do is gain control over methods of distribution of ideas. After all, even if all white men were exterminated, their books would remain. Their ideas would continue to be proliferated. Once generation of new vertical thought is slowed, proliferation of existing vertical thought needs to be slowed and ultimately stopped. But how? Through censorship of distribution channels. Social networks need to be censored. Books need to be censored. All educational material needs to be censored. And finally, language itself needs to be censored. Thirdly, our feminist liberators will need to erase all historical records of vertical thought. After all, history is merely his story. We need a new history, her story, her story. If the patriarchy is understood as I had previously posited, namely, the entirety of that which has been created through vertical thinking, then all the policies and methods we see applied by feminists make sense. Indeed, their project is consistent with the idea of smashing the patriarchy. Now, several questions are still left unanswered. The first and most important is, how does the disposition of a feminist prophet come into being? What is the constituting force behind misology, and misology being the hatred of argument and reason? How does such a hatred develop in a human being? This will be the subject of my next video in this series. In answering this question, we will cover other related questions. Questions such as, how can we know that lateral thinking is superior to vertical thinking? And how do we know that oppression will not result from lateral thinking? Thanks for listening. Go team.